Detective Mark Grayson leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and tapped his badge with a smug grin. It was more than a piece of metal. It was his armor, his shield, his ticket to doing whatever the hell he wanted. For years, he'd played the system like a fiddle, bending rules and breaking a few when necessary. The department looked the other way because he got results. Criminals feared him. Colleagues respected him. And Mark? He loved every damn second of it. But tonight, something fell off. The interrogation room was cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing like an angry hive. Across the table sat Elena Reyes, her hands cuffed but her posture unervingly relaxed. She was unlike anyone he'd brought in before, calm, composed, and radiating a quiet confidence that made his skin crawl. Her dark eyes locked onto his, unflinching, as if she could see straight through his bravado. "You're wasting your time, detective," she said, her voice smooth but laced with steel. "I didn't do it." Mark smirked, flipping through the file in front of him. "That's what they all say. But here's the thing, Elena. Your prints are all over the weapon. Your alibi's full of holes. And let's not forget the witness who placed you at the scene. So, why don't you save us both some time and tell me what really happened?" Elena leaned forward, the chains on her wrists clinking softly. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? That badge, your reputation, it makes you feel invincible. But here's a piece of advice. Be careful who you mess with." Her words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Mark's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered, slamming the file shut. "Cute, real cute, but save the threats for someone who cares. You're going away for a long time, sweetheart." Elena leaned back, a faint smile playing on her lips. "We'll see." The rest of the interrogation went nowhere. Elena answered his questions with cryptic half-truths, her calm demeanor never wavering. By the time Mark left the room, he was frustrated and, though he'd never admit it, a little unnerved. Back at his desk, he poured himself a cup of stale coffee and tried to shake off the feeling. She was just another criminal, he told himself. Another case to close. But her words echoed in his mind. Be careful who you mess with. The next morning, Mark arrived at the precinct to find a sealed envelope on his desk. No return address, no postmark. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy image of him accepting an envelope from a known drug dealer 2 years ago. His stomach dropped. "What the hell?" he muttered, flipping the photo over. On the back, scrawled in neat handwriting, were 3 words. "Game on, detective." Mark's heart raced as he crumpled the photo in his fist. He glanced around the room, half expecting to see Elena's piercing eyes watching him. But she was still in her cell, waiting for her arraignment. Or so he thought. When he went to check on her, the cell was empty. The guards had no record of her being processed, no paperwork, no fingerprints, nothing. It was as if she'd never existed. Mark's badge suddenly felt heavier in his pocket. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. And he had no idea what was coming next. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, cameras flashed, and the low hum of whispered speculation filled the room. Mark Grayson sat in the front row, his jaw clenched, his badge gleaming on his belt like a talisman. He'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, building what he thought was an airtight case against Elena Reyes. But as he watched her stride into the courtroom, head held high and a faint smirk on her lips, doubt crept into the edges of his mind. Elena's defense attorney, Claire Bennett, was a force to be reckoned with. Sharp-eyed and razor-tongued, she had a reputation for dismantling prosecutions piece by piece. Mark had faced tough lawyers before, but something about Claire's steely confidence made him uneasy. The prosecution opened with a strong statement painting Elena as a cold-blooded killer. The evidence seemed damning. Her fingerprints on the murder weapon, a witness who placed her at the scene, and a motive tied to a shady business deal gone wrong. Mark sat back, folding his arms, convinced the jury would see things his way. But then Claire took the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice calm but commanding, "what you're about to hear will shock you. This case isn't about my client's guilt or innocence. It's about a detective who's so convinced of his own invincibility that he's willing to bend the truth to get what he wants. Mark's stomach dropped. He shot a glance at the prosecutor, who looked just as blindsided. Claire continued, pacing slowly in front of the jury. Detective Grayson has a history of cutting corners, of ignoring protocols, of planting evidence when it suits him. And in this case, he's done it again. The so-called evidence against my client is nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge slammed his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Claire had planted a seed of doubt, and it was already taking root. Over the next hour, Claire systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. She called into question the reliability of the witness, a small-time crook with a history of lying to the police. She presented an expert who testified that the fingerprints on the weapon could have been planted, and then, in a move that left Mark reeling, she introduced a surveillance video that contradicted the timeline of events the prosecution had laid out. Mark's confidence wavered with each passing minute. He could feel the jury's eyes on him, their skepticism growing. When Claire finally turned her attention to him, calling him to the stand, he knew he was in trouble. Detective Grayson, she began, her tone deceptively mild. How many times have you been investigated by internal affairs? Mark hesitated, his mind racing. I don't recall. Claire raised an eyebrow. Really? Let me refresh your memory. 3 times in the past 5 years. And yet, somehow, you've never faced any consequences. Isn't that right? Objection, the prosecutor shouted, but the damage was already done. Claire pressed on, her questions cutting deeper with each passing minute. By the time she finished, Mark felt exposed, his credibility in tatters. As he stepped down from the stand, he caught Elena's eye. She was smiling, a small, knowing smile that sent a chill down his spine. The trial was far from over, but one thing was clear. Mark was no longer in control. And Elena Reyes was just getting started. Mark Grayson sat in his car outside the courthouse, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The trial had adjourned for the day, but the weight of Claire Bennett's cross-examination still pressed down on him like a lead blanket. His badge, once a symbol of power, now felt like a target on his chest. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls from reporters, texts from colleagues, and a voicemail from Internal Affairs demanding a meeting. He ignored them all, his mind racing. How had it come to this? He was supposed to be the one in control, the one calling the shots. But Elena Reyes had turned the tables, and he was scrambling to keep up. When he finally got home, the sight of his front door stopped him cold. Taped to it was another envelope, identical to the one he'd received at the precinct. His hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "You should have listened to me, detective. Now it's too late." Beneath the message was a list of names, high-ranking officials, judges, and even a few cops he recognized. At the bottom of the list was his own name, circled in red. Mark's stomach churned. He crumpled the paper and shoved it into his pocket, but the words burned in his mind. He knew what this meant. Elena wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was exposing a conspiracy, and he was caught in the middle. The next morning, the media frenzy hit full force. Headlines screamed about police corruption, and Mark's face was plastered across every news outlet. Rogue detective under scrutiny, one read, "Trial reveals pattern of misconduct," declared another. His department issued a terse statement distancing themselves from him, and his colleagues avoided his gaze when he walked into the precinct. Internal Affairs called him in for questioning, and the interrogation was brutal. They grilled him about the evidence in Elena's case, about the allegations of planted fingerprints and coerced witnesses. They asked about the list of names, about his connections to the people on it. Mark denied everything, but his answers sounded hollow even to his own ears. Meanwhile, Elena's trial continued, and Claire Bennett was relentless. She called witness after witness, each one chipping away at the prosecution's case. A forensic expert testified that the murder weapon had been tampered with. A former cop turned whistleblower admitted that evidence had been falsified in other cases Mark had worked on. And then, in a bombshell moment, Claire played a recording of a phone call between Mark and a known crime boss discussing a payoff. The courtroom erupted. Mark's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury looked at Mark with open disdain, and even the judge seemed shaken. As the day ended, Mark retreated to a dimly lit bar, nursing a drink and trying to make sense of the chaos. His phone buzzed again, another anonymous message. This time, it was a photo of his house, taken from the street. The caption read, "You're not the only one who can play dirty." Mark slammed his glass down, the sound echoing through the empty bar. He was losing control, and he knew it. Elena Reyes wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was dismantling his life piece by piece. And the worst part? He had no idea what she would do next. Mark Grayson sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, surrounded by stacks of files and notes. The walls of his home office felt like they were closing in, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. He'd been suspended from the force, his badge confiscated, and his reputation in ruins. But he couldn't stop now. He had to know the truth about Elena, about the conspiracy, about why he'd been set up. The list of names from the envelope haunted him. He'd spent hours researching each one, tracing connections, and piecing together a web of corruption that stretched far beyond anything he'd imagined. Judges, politicians, cops, they were all part of it. And at the center of it all was Elena Reyes. But she wasn't the criminal he'd thought she was. A knock at the door startled him. He hesitated, then grabbed the gun from his desk drawer and approached cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw Claire Bennett standing on his porch, her expression unreadable. "What do you want?" he asked, opening the door. "Just a crack." "To talk," she said, holding up a manila folder. "You're in over your head, Grayson. And if you want to survive this, you need to listen." Mark let her in, his guard still up. Claire handed him the folder, and he flipped it open. Inside were documents, bank records, emails, and surveillance photos that detailed a massive conspiracy involving the names on the list. At the center of it all was a powerful figure. District Attorney Richard Holloway, the man who'd personally assigned Mark to Elena's case. Elena was a whistleblower, Claire explained. She worked for Holloway's office and discovered he was laundering money for a drug cartel. When she tried to expose him, he framed her for murder and made sure you were the one to arrest her. You were just a pawn, Grayson, a fall guy. Mark's mind raced as he processed the information. It all made sense now, the planted evidence, the anonymous messages, the way Elena had looked at him with pity instead of fear. She'd known the truth all along. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice tight. "Because Elena's not the enemy," Claire said. "She's trying to bring Holloway down, but she can't do it alone. And neither can you." Mark sank into a chair, the weight of his mistakes crashing down on him. He'd been so sure of himself, so convinced of his own invincibility, that he'd never stopped to question the case. Now he was paying the price. "What do we do?" he asked finally. Claire leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "We finish what Elena started. We expose Holloway and everyone else involved. But you have to be willing to burn it all down, Grayson. Your career, your reputation, everything." Mark hesitated, then nodded. He had no choice. This was his chance to make things right, to reclaim some shred of the man he used to be. The next morning, Mark walked into the courthouse with Claire by his side. The trial was in its final days, and the tension in the room was palpable. When Claire called him to the stand, the prosecutor objected, but the judge overruled him. Mark took a deep breath and began to speak. He confessed to everything, the planted evidence, the coerced witnesses, the lies he'd told to protect himself. And then he dropped the bombshell. District Attorney Richard Holloway was the real criminal, and Elena Reyes was innocent. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, and the judge called for order. But the truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the box. As Mark stepped down from the stand, he caught Elena's eye. For the first time, she smiled at him, not with pity, but with something like respect. The game wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he was on the right side. The courtroom was silent, a rare and heavy stillness that seemed to suck the air from the room. All eyes were on Mark Grayson as he stood at the center of it all, his confession still hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The jury looked stunned, the judge leaned forward in his seat, and even the reporters had stopped scribbling in their notebooks. Elena Reyes sat at the defense table, her expression unreadable. She had waited for this moment, for the truth to come out, for the walls of the conspiracy to crumble. But now that it was happening, she showed no triumph, no relief, only a quiet resolve. District Attorney Richard Holloway, seated in the gallery, was already on his feet, his face red with fury. "This is a farce," he shouted, pointing at Mark. "This man is a disgraced detective trying to save himself. You can't possibly believe his lies." The judge slammed his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Mark's testimony had ignited a fire, and it was spreading fast. Claire Bennett stood, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Your Honor, we request that Mr. Holloway be called to the stand. If he has nothing to hide, he should have no problem answering a few questions." The objection from the prosecution was immediate, but the judge overruled it. Holloway took the stand, his jaw clenched and his eyes blazing. But as Claire began her questioning, his confidence wavered. She presented the documents Mark had uncovered, bank records, emails, and surveillance photos, and methodically tied him to the conspiracy. By the time she finished, Holloway was sweating, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of the evidence. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as one of the city's most powerful men was exposed as a criminal. When the jury returned with their verdict, it was unanimous. Elena Reyes was not guilty. The judge dismissed the charges, and the courtroom erupted in a cacophony of voices. Reporters rushed to capture the moment, shouting questions at Elena, Claire, and even Mark. But Mark didn't stay to bask in the chaos. He slipped out of the courtroom and into the cool evening air, his mind racing. He'd done the right thing, but the cost was steep. His career was over, his reputation in tatters. He was a pariah, a cautionary tale. As he walked down the courthouse steps, a voice stopped him. Detective Grayson. He turned to see Elena standing there, her coat pulled tight against the chill. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, "but I'm glad you did." Mark nodded, his throat tight. "I owed you the truth." Elena stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "What happens now?" Mark shrugged, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know, but for the first time in a long time, I can live with myself." Elena reached into her pocket and handed him a small piece of paper. On it was a single word, redemption. Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Mark stood there for a long time, the paper clutched in his hand. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he was done hiding behind his badge. The reckoning had come, and for the first time in years, Mark Grayson felt free.